Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be talking about PTSD today to really understand it, and not just what it is, but what we can do about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
great.
How to retrain your brain to heal.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really stood out to me from what you sent is this story about a guy who's having like a full-on panic attack in the grocery store.
Oh, wow.
Right. He's just there trying to buy milk, but all these ordinary things are suddenly terrifying to him, like just a kid reaching for cereal or a shopping cart rattling down the aisle.
Yeah, it's amazing how those everyday sounds and sights can become so distorted and scary for someone with PTSD.
It is, and
Yeah.
it's easy to look at that and be like, "What? Why is this guy freaking out?"
Eh,
It's just a grocery store.
right,
But that's the thing. To his brain, it's not just a grocery store.
right.
It's like his internal alarm system is stuck on high alert.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to remember that his brain isn't actually broken. It's working exactly as it's supposed to. It's just stuck in survival mode.
Right.
Like, imagine if you were in a real life or death situation, right? Your heart races, your senses sharpen, you become like hyper aware of every little thing. That's your fight or flight response.
Right.
It's kicking in to protect you. But with PTSD, that same response gets triggered by things that are totally safe, like that guy in the grocery store.
So basically, his brain's hitting the panic button for
Mhm.
like a stub toe.
Yeah.
But the good news is we can retrain the brain to respond differently.
Exactly. That's the amazing thing about the brain. It's incredibly adaptable. It's like learning a new skill.
So this deep dive is all about giving people those tools. I like that, giving them the
Yeah,
tools.
exactly.
So the sources laid out these 5 key ingredients
Mm-hmm.
for retraining the brain. I like to think of them as like building a chicken soup for the mind.
I love that analogy.
Right. So what's the first ingredient in our mental chicken soup?
Well, the base of any good soup is a rich broth, right? And in this case, it's what's called contextual awareness.
Okay, contextual awareness.
And this is all about understanding that trauma can really warp your brain's ability to accurately assess what's happening in the present moment. It's like your brain gets stuck in the past, replaying the traumatic event as if it's happening right now.
So it's not just the flashbacks. It's like losing that ability to ground yourself in the here and now.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do we start to rebuild that context then?
Well, one technique that I find really helpful is the sensory inventory.
Sensory inventory.
Yeah.
That one really jumped out at me too. So how
Yeah.
does that actually work?
Okay, so think of your brain as a detective at a crime scene.
Okay.
It's constantly gathering evidence through your senses to try to figure out what's going on.
Right.
The sensory inventory is about becoming more aware of that process.
Okay.
So you actively tune into each of your senses: sight, sound, touch, smell, taste, and you ask yourself, what am I actually experiencing right now?
Okay.
And how likely is it that this is really related to my trauma?
So like with the guy in the grocery store, if he hears a loud bang, instead of immediately assuming it's gunfire, he might take a moment to notice, okay, there's a car backfiring outside.
Right.
The probability of this being a threat is actually really low.
Exactly. You're essentially training your brain to be more discerning, to differentiate between what's a real threat and what's just a harmless trigger.
It's like adding a fact-checking layer to your brain's automatic responses.
Yeah, I like that.
Your brain is a detective.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes you realize how often our brains just jump to conclusions without even considering all the facts.
That's so true, and that's what we're trying to change here. We're trying to create space between that initial sensation and your reaction to give your brain a chance to catch up and say, hold on a second, maybe this isn't what I think it is.
That's such a powerful reframe.
Yeah.
Another technique that I saw for building this contextual awareness is temporal displacement. And I'm really intrigued by this idea of using a simple object to ground yourself in the present moment.
Oh, this is a great one, especially for when you feel like you're really stuck in the past, reliving the trauma.
Yeah.
It's so simple, but it can be surprisingly effective.
Okay, I'm ready. Tell me.
Okay, so pick up any ordinary object, like a pen, a coffee mug, anything,
Okay.
and just spend a few minutes describing it in detail.
Okay.
Notice the shape, the texture, the weight, the color. Really immerse yourself in the sensory experience of that object.
So instead of getting swept away by the past, you're hyper-focused on the present. You're basically proving to your brain that time does move forward.
Exactly. You're anchoring yourself in the here and now, showing your brain that you're not trapped in that traumatic moment anymore.
It's like hitting the reset button on your internal clock. Okay, so we've talked about this foundation of contextual awareness.
Mm.
But what about those physical sensations that come with PTSD? You know, that racing heart, That feeling of being on edge all the time.
Right, that's where our next ingredient comes in. It's called interoceptive precision.
Interoceptive precision.
And this is about tuning into your body's internal signals and learning how to interpret them accurately.
Because our bodies are sending us messages all the time, but with PTSD, it's like we're misinterpreting those messages.
Exactly. It's like your body is this weather station, right?
Okay.
Sending out reports about what's happening internally. But with PTSD, that weather station gets a bit scrambled. A sudden gust of wind might feel like a tornado. A light drizzle might feel like a torrential downpour.
So you might mistake a racing heart from just exercise for a panic attack.
Hmm.
Or feel like you're having a heart attack when it's really just indigestion.
Exactly. You're not wrong to feel those sensations, but your interpretation of them might be off.
So how do we start to unscramble those signals then? And really understand what our bodies are trying to tell us?
Well, one technique that I really like is the bodily weather report.
Bodily weather report.
Yeah.
I like that.
It's kind of fun, right?
It is.
So instead of getting caught up in the emotion of your body's sensations, you become a neutral observer, like a meteorologist just reporting the forecast.
I like it.
You simply describe what you're feeling physically without any judgment or interpretation.
So instead of saying, I'm freaking out because my chest is tight, you'd say, I'm noticing a sensation of pressure in my chest. It feels like a band constricting around my rib cage.
Exactly. You're separating the raw sensation from the emotional story you usually attach to it.
And that can actually reduce the intensity of the feeling.
Often, yeah. Just the simple act of labeling it differently can help.
It's like you're taking the power away from the sensation by just acknowledging it.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really cool.
And as you practice this, you'll start to notice your body's constantly sending you signals. And most of them are totally normal fluctuations. You don't have to react to every single one.
It's like learning to tell the difference between a passing shower and a real storm.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got contextual awareness, we've got interoceptive precision. What's next?
So the next ingredient is all about challenging those deeply ingrained expectations of danger. That can keep someone trapped in a cycle of fear and avoidance.
Okay, I'm interested.
This is called expectation violation.
Expectation violation. Oh.
Yeah, and this is where we start to challenge those rigid beliefs about the world, that trauma can kind of burn into our brains.
Because trauma can really warp how safe or dangerous we think the world is right.
Absolutely. It's like your brain gets stuck in this loop, constantly scanning for threats, even when there aren't any.
So it's like your internal GPS is set to avoid all possible dangers, even if that means never leaving the house.
Exactly.
Wow, okay, so this element is about showing your brain that those expectations are often wrong, that the world isn't always out to get you.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do we start to do that?
Well, one technique that I think is really powerful is something called the deliberate mundane expedition.
Deliberate mundane expedition.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, I know.
Yeah.
But it's all about proving to your brain that unpredictability doesn't automatically equal danger.
Okay.
So the next time you're driving somewhere familiar, right, take a deliberate wrong turn.
Okay.
And, I mean, don't plan it out. Just turn down a road you've never been on before.
So you're intentionally getting yourself a little bit lost.
Yeah, but in a controlled environment.
Okay.
And the point is to discover that being lost doesn't automatically lead to catastrophe.
Right.
It's just information. You can always course correct. You can always find your way back.
So it's creating those little deviations from your routine
Right.
to show your brain that it can handle the unexpected.
Exactly.
I like that. I like that a lot. So we've talked about understanding the present moment, deciphering our body's signals, challenging those expectations of danger. But what about all the emotional turmoil that comes with PTSD? You know, how do we start to untangle all of that?
Yeah, that's a big one, right? And that's where our next ingredient comes in. It's called emotional granularity.
Emotional granularity, okay.
Trauma often causes this kind of collapsing of all negative emotions into one big feeling. Fear.
Right.
And that lack of nuance. It can make it really hard to process what you're going through.
It's like all those complex emotions just get jumbled up into one big ball of anxiety.
Exactly.
So this element is about learning to differentiate between them. Like sadness, anger, frustration, shame, and fear.
Exactly.
You're not trying to eliminate those emotions, but you're trying to understand the nuances of each of them.
Yeah, it's about creating space for them.
So when you can name it, you can tame it.
Something like that, yeah.
So how do we start to cultivate this emotional granularity then?
Well, there's a technique that I find really helpful. It's called the wrong label exercise.
The wrong label exercise.
Yeah, and it's one of my favorites because it's so counterintuitive.
Yeah. Tell me more.
Most of us are always trying to find the right word to label how we feel. But this technique actually encourages you to do the opposite. If you're feeling anxious, call it mild amusement. If you're feeling sad, call it irritation.
So you're deliberately mislabeling your emotions. I
Exactly.
don't get it. What's the point of that?
The point is to break that automatic connection between the sensation and your interpretation of it.
Okay.
And what you'll often find is that the feeling exists independently of the label you give it.
Mm,
So it's a really powerful way to create some distance from the intensity of the emotion.
that's interesting. I can see how that could be helpful,
Yeah,
especially when you feel completely overwhelmed by a certain emotion, like you're taking away some of its power.
exactly.
Another technique that I saw for this was the bodily location inventory. I like that one too.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
What is that one all about?
So this one is about recognizing that emotions aren't just mental states. They manifest in the body too.
Okay.
So instead of thinking, I feel anxious, you ask yourself, where do I feel this anxiety in my body? Is it a tightness in your chest? A knot in your stomach?
So you're bringing awareness to the physical sensations
Exactly.
that are associated with the emotion.
Exactly. And by mapping those sensations, you create a much more concrete, less overwhelming experience. It's like you're grounding the emotion in your body, preventing it from spiraling out of control.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's like you're taking something abstract and making it more tangible.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered the first four ingredients of our mental chicken soup: contextual awareness, interoceptive precision, expectation violation, and emotional granularity.
That's a lot.
It is.
We've done a lot of work today.
We have.
But there's one more big one to go,
There is.
and it's a really interesting one.
Okay, I can't wait.
Yeah, I think you're going to like this one. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but it's super powerful.
Okay, well, we'll save that one for next time. But thank you so much for today. This was great.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
So, to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for part one of this deep dive into PTSD. Make sure to tune in for part two, where we'll be talking about that last crucial ingredient, and we'll really get into how to start putting all these techniques into practice. We'll see you then.
See you then.
Bye. Okay, so welcome back to our deep dive into understanding and retraining the brain after trauma. We've been talking about these 5 essential elements for healing from PTSD. And, I like to think of them as ingredients like this delicious mental chicken soup. So far, we've added contextual awareness to help ground us in the present moment, and an interoceptive precision to accurately interpret our body's signals, an expectation violation to challenge, those ingrained fears, and emotional granularity to really untangle that knot of overwhelming feelings. But there's one last ingredient to add to our soup, and it's maybe the most intriguing one. It's called exposure regulation. And I have to admit, this one feels a bit counterintuitive to me. Why would we intentionally expose ourselves to the things that trigger us?
Yeah, it's a natural question. And it's really important to understand that exposure therapy isn't about reliving the trauma or forcing yourself into overwhelming situations. Instead, think of it as carefully and gradually introducing yourself to those triggers, but in a safe and controlled environment.
So it's like dipping your toes in the water before jumping in the deep end.
That's a great way to put it. And the reason this works is because it helps to recalibrate your brain's threat response system. It's like showing your brain a sneak peek of the scary movie and proving that it's not as terrifying as it anticipates.
Okay, that makes sense. But
Yeah.
I'm still a little wary of this whole exposure thing. What if it backfires and makes things worse?
That's why it's so important to approach exposure therapy with a qualified therapist, someone who can really guide you through the process and ensure your safety. They'll help you identify the right, dosage of exposure, starting with things that cause very minimal distress and gradually increasing the intensity as you build tolerance. It's like adding just the right amount of seasoning to our chicken soup, right? Too much and it's overwhelming. Too little and it's bland.
I like that, yeah. So what are some practical techniques for incorporating exposure regulation into our healing journey?
Well, one technique that I find really helpful is a micro-exposure ladder.
Micro-exposure ladder.
Yeah, it's all about starting small and building up gradually. So let's say a specific smell is a trigger for you, right? Instead of immediately exposing yourself to that smell, you might start by just thinking about the smell, then maybe looking at pictures of the object that produces that smell, and then maybe walking past a store that sells that kind of product without actually trying to smell it.
So you're creating this hierarchy of exposure, starting with the least triggering and working your way up.
Exactly. And the key is to stay at each step until the anxiety subsides, proving to your brain that that trigger is not actually dangerous.
Okay, that's really helpful. Another technique that I saw was the prediction check protocol. What is that one all about?
So this one is all about exposing the tendency we have to overestimate how intense our anxiety is actually going to be.
Okay.
Before you engage with the trigger, you consciously predict how much distress it's going to cause, like on a scale of 1 to 100.
Okay.
Then, after you experience the trigger, you immediately record your actual level of distress.
So you're basically testing your anxiety against reality.
Exactly. And what you'll often find is that your predictions are way higher than the actual experience, which is powerful evidence that your threat response system is overcalibrated.
It's like your brain is shouting fire when there's just a little smoke.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah.
And by repeatedly doing these prediction checks, you start to chip away at those exaggerated fear responses.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how exposure regulation, while maybe a bit scary at first, can be a really powerful tool
Yeah, it definitely can be,
for retraining the brain.
for sure.
But I imagine there are times when even those micro exposures feel too overwhelming.
Absolutely.
Are there any techniques for easing into this process even more gently?
There are. One technique that comes to mind is the sensory deprivation variation.
Sensory deprivation variation. Okay.
And this is based on the idea that our memories are often most vivid and triggering because of how sensory rich they are.
So this technique is about reducing the sensory input.
Exactly, almost like dimming the lights on a scary movie.
I like that.
So let's say you're working with a memory that involves a lot of visual triggers. Instead of watching a full-blown movie related to the trauma, you might start by just listening to the soundtrack or watching a scene with the sound muted and the screen dimmed.
So you're creating like a sanitized version of the memory?
Precisely. By removing some of the sensory details, you can actually reduce the emotional impact and allow yourself to observe the underlying narrative in a more detached way.
It's like taking the sting out of the memory without having to avoid it completely.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting. Another technique that I saw was the narrative disruption technique. Can you tell me a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, so this one is all about messing with that rigid, repetitive narrative that often accompanies traumatic memories. So the idea is to introduce a small, irrelevant detail into your recollection of the event. Something absurd, something that doesn't belong.
So instead of focusing on the traumatic aspects, you throw in something completely random, like a pink flamingo lawn ornament.
Exactly. It sounds silly, but it can be surprisingly effective. It's like throwing a wrench into the gears of that trauma narrative,
Yeah.
disrupting its flow and demonstrating that that memory isn't fixed.
It's like saying to your brain, hey, this isn't a sacred script.
Yeah,
We can play around with it a little bit.
exactly.
That's really interesting. So we've talked about all these different ways to approach exposure, but how do you know if it's working? What are some signs that your brain is actually starting to recalibrate its threat response?
That's a great question. One important concept to understand is the habituation plateau.
Habituation plateau.
Yeah, and this is the idea that exposure isn't always about seeing a steady decrease in anxiety.
Okay.
Sometimes it's about reaching a point where the anxiety stabilizes, even with repeated exposure.
So you're not necessarily looking for the anxiety to go away completely.
Right. That plateau doesn't mean you failed. It actually indicates success.
Yeah.
It means your brain has learned to categorize that stimulus as non-threatening, even if it still registers some level of response. It's like your brain is saying, okay, I see you, but I'm not going to freak out about it anymore.
I think that's so important to emphasize
Yeah.
because it can be really discouraging if you're expecting the anxiety to just disappear.
Absolutely. Healing from trauma is a process. It's not a linear progression. There will be ups and downs, plateaus, breakthroughs. The key is to just keep going, to trust the process, and to celebrate those small victories along the way.
Yeah, I love that. Recognizing that even the smallest shifts in your anxiety levels are signs of progress. Being patient with yourself and celebrating those moments when you realize you're not as afraid as you used to be.
Exactly.
So we've added all 5 ingredients to our mental chicken soup: contextual awareness, interoceptive precision, expectation violation, emotional granularity, and exposure regulation.
Wow, it sounds delicious.
It does. All right, well, join us for part 3, where we'll savor the flavors of this metaphorical soup and distill the key takeaways from this journey. And we'll leave you with some final thoughts and resources to support your continued healing and growth.
Welcome back to our deep dive into PTSD. We've covered so much ground already, exploring these 5 essential elements for retraining the brain. It's like we've been simmering this delicious pot of mental chicken soup.
Right. I like that. We started by building that base of contextual awareness, recognizing how trauma can distort our perception of the present moment.
Yeah.
And then we added interoceptive precision, learning to accurately interpret our body's signals instead of, automatically jumping to the worst case scenario.
Right.
And then we sprinkled in some expectation violation,
Yeah.
challenging those like really deep-seated fears and proving to our brains that the world isn't always as dangerous as it seems.
Yeah, that's such an important one.
It is. It is. We stirred in a healthy dose of emotional granularity, developing the ability to differentiate between all those jumbled up feelings and give them space to breathe.
Right.
And finally, we added the most unexpected ingredient of all, exposure regulation. Understanding how gradually and safely facing our fears can actually help to recalibrate our threat response system.
It's amazing how that works, right?
It is. This
Wow.
whole mental chicken soup analogy has been really helpful for me.
Me
Just
too.
kind of wrap my head around all these concepts.
Yeah. It's a great way to visualize the process because it highlights how interconnected all these elements are. They all work together to create this nourishing and healing environment for the brain.
Yeah, and I think,
Mm-hmm.
if someone's listening to this and they're feeling overwhelmed by the prospect of tackling all 5 of these elements at once,
Right.
what would you say to them?
I would say, first and foremost, be patient with yourself. Healing from trauma is a journey. It's not a race. It's not about achieving some kind of perfect state of healing. It's about making gradual progress, celebrating those small victories, and recognizing that setbacks are a normal part of the process.
It's like learning to cook, you
Yeah.
know? You don't become a master chef overnight. You start with simple recipes, you practice your techniques, you gradually build your confidence, and even the best chefs mess up sometimes.
Exactly. And just like learning to cook, you don't have to do this alone. There are therapists, there are support groups, there are online resources that can provide guidance, encouragement, and a sense of community.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important message. Because it's so easy to feel isolated and ashamed when you're struggling with PTSD. But you're not alone, and there is help available.
Absolutely.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this sense of hope and possibility.
Yeah.
You know, even though PTSD can feel so incredibly debilitating, understanding the science behind it and having these practical tools to work with can really empower you to reclaim your life.
I couldn't agree more. The brain is such an adaptable organ. And with the right support and guidance, it can learn to navigate the world in a way that feels safer and more manageable.
So if you're listening to this and you're struggling with PTSD, know that you're not broken. Your brain is not broken. It's simply trying to protect you in the best way it knows how. And with time, patience, and the right tools, you can teach it a new way to respond to the world.
You really can.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into PTSD. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and a renewed sense of hope for healing and recovery.
Absolutely.
All right, everyone, take care.
Take care.